By the year 2000, the Oslo dream was hanging by a thread. The world turned to Camp David, the U.S. presidential retreat, for one last chance at peace. President Bill Clinton invited Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat to negotiate a final settlement. Jerusalem, borders, refugees, the questions that had haunted generations were laid on the table. For 2 weeks, the talks dragged on. Maps were drawn, proposals exchanged, but trust was absent. Barak offered a plan that included most of Gaza and much of the West Bank, but Palestinians saw the territory as fragmented, islands surrounded by Israeli control. Arafat rejected it, saying no people could accept a state cut into pieces. On the other side, Israelis felt that Arafat refused to compromise, especially on Jerusalem. Barak left the talks believing there was no partner for peace. When the negotiations collapsed, Clinton called it a missed opportunity. But for Palestinians, it was more than a failure. It was proof that the promises of Oslo had been empty. Frustration was boiling, checkpoints, settlements, and daily humiliations piled high. Refugees still waited for a return that never came, and the dream of a Palestinian state seemed further than ever. In the streets of Gaza, Nablus, and East Jerusalem, whispers of uprising began again. History was about to repeat itself. On September 28, 2000, Ariel Sharon, the hardline leader of Israel's opposition, made a controversial visit to one of the most sacred and sensitive places on earth, the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif. For Jews, it is the site of the ancient temples. For Muslims, it is home to Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, Islam's third holiest site. Here, faith and politics collide like nowhere else. Sharon's arrival, flanked by hundreds of Israeli police, was seen by Palestinians as a deliberate provocation, a signal that Israel would never share Jerusalem. The next day, protests erupted. Stones flew at Israeli police. Bullets and tear gas answered. The clashes spread beyond Jerusalem, igniting the West Bank and Gaza. Television screens around the world showed images of Palestinian youth confronting tanks with nothing but rocks. It was a haunting echo of the First Intifada. But this time, the violence would spiral far beyond street battles. The Second Intifada had begun, and it would shake the region for years to come.
The violence escalated rapidly. What began with clashes at holy sites soon spread into streets, buses, cafes, and neighborhoods. Palestinian militant groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and even factions of Fatah unleashed a wave of suicide bombings. Restaurants, buses, nightclubs, no place felt safe. For Israelis, daily life turned into a nightmare. Parents feared putting their children on buses. Every cafe visit carried a shadow of dread. The sound of sirens became routine. Israel struck back with overwhelming force. Tanks rolled into Palestinian towns. The West Bank and Gaza saw curfews, house demolitions, and targeted assassinations. Entire refugee camps were surrounded, cut off for days. Checkpoints multiplied, strangling movement. For Palestinians, daily life became a struggle for survival, with humiliation and fear part of every journey. Between 2000 and 2005, over 3,000 Palestinians and around 1,000 Israelis lost their lives. Blood flowed on both sides, leaving deep scars that would shape generations. The dream of peace born in Oslo now seemed like a distant memory. Instead, both peoples were trapped in cycles of retaliation, grief, and mistrust.
By early 2002, the Second Intifada had reached its bloodiest point. Suicide bombings shook Israel almost daily, while the army intensified raids across the West Bank. The breaking point came in March. After a devastating bombing in Netanya killed 30 people celebrating Passover, Israel launched its largest military operation in the West Bank since 1967, Operation Defensive Shield. Tanks and armored vehicles stormed into 6 major Palestinian cities: Ramallah, Bethlehem, Nablus, Tulkarm, Qalqilia, and Jenin. The fiercest battle erupted in Jenin refugee camp, a dense labyrinth of alleys and concrete homes. Israel accused militants of turning the camp into a stronghold for attacks. Palestinian fighters, outgunned but determined, fought house to house, laying traps and ambushes. After 10 days of brutal combat, the camp lay in ruins. Israel declared victory. Palestinians called it a massacre. Human rights groups later documented heavy destruction, civilian deaths, and widespread displacement. Operation Defensive Shield left behind shattered cities, traumatized communities, and a peace process buried deeper in the rubble.
After the devastating wave of suicide bombings in the early 2000s, Israel made a decision that would permanently reshape the land, to build a barrier. For Israelis, it was called a security fence, a shield to stop attackers from entering cities and towns. For Palestinians, it became known simply as the Wall. Stretching for hundreds of kilometers, the barrier was built with wire fences, trenches, patrol roads, and in many areas, towering concrete walls. Israel argued it was necessary to protect civilians, and indeed, after sections of the barrier went up, suicide bombings inside Israel dropped sharply. But for Palestinians, the wall was more than concrete and wire. It cut through villages, separated families, and isolated farmers from their land. In some places, it didn't follow the 1967 borders, but carved deep into the West Bank, surrounding settlements and fragmenting communities. The International Court of Justice condemned it as illegal. Israelis saw protection, Palestinians saw imprisonment. The wall became more than a physical barrier. It became a symbol of division, mistrust, and the death of the Oslo dream. In 2005, after decades of occupation, Israel made a dramatic move. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon ordered a unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Thousands of Israeli settlers were evacuated. Their homes and communities, some built over decades, were dismantled by the Israeli army. For Palestinians, it was a moment of triumph. A land reclaimed. But the hope was short-lived. Gaza soon fell into political turmoil. In 2006, Hamas won legislative elections, challenging Fatah's dominance. Tensions exploded into open warfare on Gaza's streets. By 2007, Hamas had seized full control, while Fatah was left governing only the West Bank. Israel and Egypt responded with a blockade, sealing Gaza's borders. Goods, medicine, and fuel trickled in under tight restrictions. The aim, Israel said, was to weaken Hamas. But for ordinary Gazans, the blockade meant suffocating poverty, blackouts, and a sense of being trapped in one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Gaza had become a flashpoint, a place of celebration turned into a prison, where every flicker of hope seemed to vanish into smoke. By the late 2000s, Gaza had become the epicenter of a recurring cycle of war. In December 2008, after years of rocket fire from Hamas militants and a tightening Israeli blockade, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead, a 3-week military assault on Gaza. The campaign devastated the territory. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. More than 1,300 Palestinians were killed, including hundreds of civilians. 13 Israelis also lost their lives, most of them soldiers. International outrage grew, with accusations of war crimes and disproportionate force. But Israel insisted it was acting in self-defense to stop rockets raining down on its towns and cities. The war ended with a ceasefire, but it was far from the end. In 2012 and again in 2014, violence erupted on an even larger scale. Operation Protective Edge in 2014 became one of the deadliest wars in Gaza's history. More than 2,000 Palestinians were killed, alongside 73 Israelis. For civilians on both sides, the wars brought unbearable fear. In Gaza, families lived under the roar of jets, never knowing where the next bomb would fall. In southern Israel, children grew up with only seconds to run when sirens wailed. Each war ended in shaky ceasefires, each ceasefire followed by more rockets, more strikes, and more funerals. Gaza remained trapped in a cycle where destruction always returned and peace never arrived.
By the mid-2010s, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict entered a new phase, one of stalemate. Major wars quieted, but peace talks froze. Israeli settlements in the West Bank expanded at record pace, housing more than 400,000 settlers by 2019. Palestinians saw their land shrinking, piece by piece, hill by hill. In Gaza, Hamas remained in control, locked in tension with Israel and estranged from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. The Palestinian leadership was divided, weakening its position on the global stage. Meanwhile, Israel's politics shifted steadily rightward. Benjamin Netanyahu, the country's longest-serving prime minister, embraced settlement growth and resisted concessions. For many Israelis, the priority was security, not negotiations. The United States further tilted the scales. In 2018, President Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the U.S. embassy there. A move celebrated in Israel but condemned by Palestinians, who saw East Jerusalem as the heart of their future state. Beyond the conflict, the Middle East itself was changing. Arab states like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates began quiet cooperation with Israel, driven by shared fears of Iran and economic interests. The Palestinian cause, once the region's rallying cry, no longer commanded the same central place. For Palestinians, hope faded into frustration. For Israelis, strength brought security, but also deeper isolation from peace. The sands were shifting, but not toward resolution.
In 2020, history took a sharp turn. While Palestinians remained under occupation and blockade, Israel signed groundbreaking agreements with Arab states, the Abraham Accords. Brokered by the United States, the accords normalized relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and later Sudan. Flights connected Tel Aviv to Dubai. Business deals flourished. Tourists crossed borders once thought impossible. For Israel, it was a diplomatic triumph, recognition and cooperation without resolving the Palestinian question. For Palestinians, it felt like betrayal. The Arab world, long their champion, now seemed to move on. Leaders in Abu Dhabi and Manama justified their moves as pragmatic. Peace, trade, and technology partnerships outweighed old rivalries. But on the streets of Ramallah and Gaza, anger grew. The cause of Palestine was slipping from the region's center stage. Meanwhile, violence still simmered. In 2021, tensions in Jerusalem spilled into another round of war in Gaza. Rockets and airstrikes once again lit up the skies. The new alignments had not ended the old conflict, they had only redrawn the map around it. Today, the Israel-Palestine conflict remains one of the world's most intractable struggles. In the West Bank, settlements continue to grow, reshaping the map. Tensions between settlers and Palestinians erupt daily, while checkpoints and military raids keep lives under constant strain. In Gaza, 2 million people live under blockade, facing shortages of power, medicine, and jobs. Rockets and airstrikes flare up with grim regularity, leaving scars on both sides of the border. Internationally, the world is divided. Some nations recognize Palestine, others strengthen ties with Israel. Global protests demand justice, but peace talks remain frozen. Generations have grown up knowing only conflict. Yet, beneath the weight of history, voices of hope persist. Activists, peacemakers, families who dream of a different tomorrow. The land between the river and the sea carries stories of prophets, kingdoms, exiles, and wars. It has changed the world before, and its fate will continue to shape the world's future. This is not just a story of borders and politics. It is a story of people, of dreams deferred, and of a question that still echoes across the globe. Will there ever be peace in the land called holy?